you. Good to have you here. If you're watching online, thanks for joining us online as well. Swiftly approaching just a few weeks. On that day, that Sunday, we are going together with all three campi at Tyrone High School auditorium at 10 a.m. Okay, so on Easter Sunday, don't come here. Go out to Tyrone, to the high school. You'll see all the cars and people coming into the building out there. In light of that, this is a great time for you to invite your friends, your relatives, your coworkers, your neighbors. We talk about this oftentimes about praying for those people in our lives that don't know Jesus and investing in their lives and then hopefully inviting them. This is a great opportunity to invite those people in your life. Most people will accept, out of any other time of the year, they'll accept an invitation to come to church on Easter, because, right, that's what everyone does, right? So we have some cards that are out on the table as you're leaving today. If you'll grab a few of those cards, take them, give them out to your friends, your relatives, your coworkers, your neighbors, invite them to join us that Sunday in April 5th at the Tyrone High School auditorium at 10 a.m. So that is out there. Also, as was mentioned in the prayer, this evening, we're going to have Ethan, the other Ethan. We're trying to figure out how to distinguish between the two. But there is another Ethan, Ethan Lenning, who is a potential youth pastor candidate. He is going to be here this evening. If you would like to come, there's going to be a question and answer time. And then afterwards, he's actually going to teach the youth group so we can get a feel for that. You're not invited to that, but you can come and ask some questions and stuff, things like that. So that'll be here at church this evening. That information is available. Also, if you are a mom of a preschooler or no moms of preschoolers, I guess, the ladies are having a gathering. That information is in the bulletin as well, time and day of that as well. So all that information is there for you to look at. But today we are continuing on in our series entitled Investigating Jesus. So today we're going to be in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 9. So as you're turning there, I want to ask you a question. Whose voice carries the most weight in your life? Is it a spouse? Is it a parent? Is it a neighbor, a coworker, a boss, a coach, a teacher? Whose voice in your life carries the most weight? When you hear them speak, you are attentive to listen to what they have to say. I remember when I was in seminary, I was walking down the hallway of the student center, and as I was kind of walking along, minding my own business, I heard a voice behind me say, in a very commanding voice, "Stop." And it was an unmistakable voice. It was the voice of the president of our seminary. And the president of our seminary at the time, he was a very imposing, very commanding, he had a very commanding presence about him. And anytime he walked around campus, everybody seemed to stand a little straighter. People started using actual theological terms when he was in earshot. Everyone listened to him because he was the president of the seminary. And whatever he said, it was the final word on campus. And so when I was walking down the hallway and I heard him say, "Stop," in a very loud, commanding voice, I immediately stopped. I thought, all right, did I not have my shirt tucked in? Did I not study enough for the one test? In my mind, I'm like, what is going on here? And so I froze there for what seemed like an eternity, but was only just a second or so. And then I kind of looked over my shoulder. I was a little afraid to look over my shoulder, but I looked behind me, and he was speaking to his dog that he typically brought on campus with him. But when I heard him say "stop," I knew that I should probably stop. And I thought maybe he was talking to me because his word was the final word. His voice carried weight on our campus. And the truth is, there are people in our life that if a stranger told us to stop, we would probably just simply ignore them and keep on going. If a loved one or a friend said stop, you might turn around and say, "Well, why do you want me to stop?" If a police officer tells you to stop, hopefully you stop, okay? Because their voice carries weight. The problem that we have in our world today is that there's so many voices that are competing for our attention. Our culture has a voice. The politics has a voice. Sometimes our past has a voice, our emotions have a voice. And so we have all of these voices in our lives that are competing for our attention and want to actually take control of our lives. And what happens is oftentimes, even as believers, that we just simply consider the voice of Jesus as just one voice among many. we consider his opinion just as valid as anyone else's opinion. And oftentimes his voice is not necessarily the loudest, and it's not necessarily the most popular, and oftentimes we just simply kind of ignore it. And so today, what I want you to take home with you is this, as we continue to investigate Jesus, is that Jesus is the final word. Jesus is the final word. He's the final word in matters of life and death. He's the final word in righteousness and unrighteousness. He's the final word in every aspect of our lives, how we live financially, relationally, emotionally, and of course, spiritually, that he is the final word in every area of our life. And the writer of Hebrews captured this in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. And he wrote these words: God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers in the prophets and in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and whom also he made all the world. That the writer of Hebrews says that in this last day that God has spoken to us in his Son, that Jesus is the final word. That in the past he spoke through prophets and he did it in all kinds of different ways. There was a time that he spoke through a burning bush. There was a time in which he spoke in a whirlwind. But in these last days, he has spoken to us in his Son. Jesus is the final word. And so today, as we continue our series investigating Jesus, we're going to see today that Jesus is the final word. And this series is built upon the Gospel of Luke, who started his gospel, his narrative of Jesus' life, with the words that he thoroughly investigated everything. He went and he interviewed the people who were there, the people who were the eyewitnesses, the people who had firsthand experiences and encounters with Jesus, and everything that he wrote down was thoroughly investigated. And we're kind of picking up on that in this series, and we are investigating Jesus and understanding ultimately the character and the personality of Jesus. Because if Jesus is who he claimed to be, it has tremendous ramifications in our life. He's not somebody that we can just simply ignore. It's not somebody that we can just simply have a laissez-faire attitude towards, that he demands respect and obedience if he is who he said he is. And so that's why our memory verse comes from Luke chapter 14, verse 27, which tells us, whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. That Jesus, the authority that he has, and because of who he is by nature, it commands and demands our complete allegiance and sacrifice to him. And so we started this series week 1, and we saw week 1 that Jesus is perfect, and how he was in the wilderness for 40 days, and how the devil had tempted him. And there we learned that we are to trust his perfection, not our performance. There's nothing that you and I can do to make us good enough for God. And in that light, we must trust the perfection of Jesus, who fulfilled every aspect of the law in our place. Last week, if you were here, we saw last week that Jesus is the authority. That he is the authority in our life. That we saw last week how he commanded all the fish to jump into the net of the fishermen, and how he called those fishermen ultimately to follow him, and they left everything behind. They left the nets, they left all the great catch of fish, they left their friends, they left their family, they left their business, they left their dreams, they left everything and followed him. And so last week I encouraged all of us to fully commit to follow Jesus. And it's more than just walking behind him. It means that we should desire to become like him. We should be like him in how we talk and how we think and how we relate to one another and how we respond in situations, that his thoughts and his attitudes should ultimately become our thoughts and our attitudes. And so today, week 3, we're in Luke chapter 9, and today we're going to see that Jesus is the final word. That ultimately, whatever he says is the final word in my life and your life. So, Luke chapter 9, kind of a lot of events transpired from where we left off last week, and he called Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and they left everything and they went and followed him. And Luke, in the next few chapters after that, described how Jesus' popularity just continued to grow and grow and grow. I mean, he raised someone's son from the dead. He was dead and Jesus made him alive again. He went around and he was healing people, and he was speaking and he was teaching about the kingdom of God and speaking in parables to all the people. And so he's getting this great following after him. And then it kind of culminates with this time in which Jesus was there, and there were 5,000 people on the hillside. And it got late in the day, and his disciples said, Jesus, you need to send them away so they can go get some food. And Jesus said to his disciples, he said, why don't you feed them? And they're like, oh, all we got is a few fish and a couple loaves of bread. Like, how's that going to feed 5,000 people? And Jesus said, well, bring it to me. They bring it to him. He breaks it. He blesses it. And he feeds 5,000 people with leftovers afterwards. Feeds all of these people. And then Luke, right after that, described an encounter that Jesus had with his disciples. After he had fed the 5,000 people, Jesus asked him, he said, so what do people think about me? Who do people say that I am? And the disciples were like, well, the people are talking, man. They think you're Elijah or one of the other prophets. Like John the Baptist maybe who's come back again. Like they think you're one of those people. And then Jesus asked him, he said, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter makes that great declaration, you are the Christ of God. You're the Messiah. You're the chosen one. You're the one that we've been waiting for generation after generation after generation. And then Jesus explained to them what ultimately was going to happen. That he was going to go to Jerusalem. He was going to be arrested, tried, and crucified. But not to worry that he was going to rise from the dead on the third day. But it was as if the disciples didn't even understand what Jesus was talking about. And so we come here to Luke chapter 9 that I'm going to read today. And we're going to see how the disciples, how some disciples had an encounter with Jesus. And how there were three amazing events that happened to reinforce to them that Jesus was the Christ, and also to demonstrate that he is the final word. So we're going to pick it up here, Luke chapter 9, actually going to begin reading in verse number 28. Okay, so Luke 9, verse 28. And it starts with these words. Some 8 days after these sayings, he took along Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. So here Luke describes it was about a week later after the feeding of the 5,000, after Jesus had asked them, who do you say that I am? And he explained to them what was going to happen to him. So Luke said about a week later, Jesus took three of his closest followers and they retreated up to the mountain in order to pray. Disciples, Peter, John, and James saw three amazing events that proved to them finally, fully, and forever that Jesus is the final word. And the first thing that they witnessed here was the transformation of Jesus. Okay, so this is the mountain here that they likely went up. And so you go to Israel, you can see this mountain. They call it the Mount of Transfiguration. So on this mountain, the first event that they see is the transformation of Jesus. That Jesus is transformed before their eyes, that they see him in a different way that they encountered previously as they were following Jesus to this point. And so Luke went on and he said, hey, they're up on the mountain and they're praying. And while he was praying, verse 29, while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different and his clothing became white and gleaming. Now here, Luke used a word. That word different is something that is a word that literally means different of a different nature. So he kind of looked the same, but it was an appearance that was unlike something that they had ever seen before. And actually, Matthew and Mark, they described this event as well, and they used the Greek word that is transliterated in our English, metamorphosis. And so here, however, what we say in theological circles is this is the transfiguration of Jesus. The transformation is where you go from one nature to another nature, like a caterpillar will transform and metamorphosize into a butterfly. Transfiguration is the idea that something that's already in there is revealed. Like a skinny kid from North Carolina was transfigured into the world's greatest basketball player in Michael Jordan. It was something that was already in there, and it just simply came to the surface. And that's what's happening here, is that Jesus is transfigured. They're seeing the glory that is already within Jesus. And Matthew described this, and he said his face was shining like the sun. Now here, Luke doesn't describe exactly what it looked like. He's just like, hey, it looked different. And Jesus' face, Matthew said, shined like the sun. And he was shining so bright that Luke wrote that his clothing became white and gleaming. Literally, in the original language, it says it was as bright as lightning. And so here, Jesus is being transfigured, and his face is shining, and it's so bright that it causes his clothing to almost glow in the dark. And what we're seeing here is an event that is going to demonstrate that Jesus is the final word. But that's not the only thing that happened on that mountain that day. There was a second event that happened, and that was the conversation of Jesus. If seeing Jesus transfigured or transformed was not eerie enough, Jesus then had a conversation with a couple people that was even more dramatic and amazing in the occurrence that had happened. And so here Luke went on and he says, hey, his face became different, his clothing became white and gleaming. Verse 30, and behold, two men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah. Now, it's no accident that these two people were the ones who were speaking with Jesus, because their appearance has very deep significance. Moses, of course, would have been the personification of the law, right? I mean, he's the one that God had given the Ten Commandments to. He's the one that wrote down all the law. He's the one who wrote those first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, to tell the people how they were to live. And Elijah would have been the personification of the prophets. Now, all the prophets, Isaiah and Daniel, would have been personified in Elijah. So what you have here is Jesus speaking with the law and the prophets, which would have been considered the totality of the Hebrew Scriptures, the totality of the Old Testament, the law and the prophets. Many times that's the way it was referenced, the law and the prophets. And here Jesus is standing in their midst and he's speaking to them. And it's important to understand that the law was written anticipating the coming of the Messiah. That every law was a shadow to point towards this coming Christ. And then, of course, the prophets are the ones who were predicting the coming of the Messiah. And over again, you read about predictions about where he was going to be born and where he was going to live and ultimately how he was going to die. And all the prophets predicted the coming of the Messiah. So here you have one who personifies the anticipation of the coming of the Messiah. Another person who personifies the prediction of the coming of the Messiah. And what are they doing? They're talking to the Messiah. And so here it is, this conversation that is happening. And Luke went on and described this even further. And he said, who appearing in glory were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. So here he tells us, Luke wrote that Moses and Elijah were also appeared in a glorious form. I mean, probably not as glorious as Jesus, but they didn't look like they looked when they walked on the earth. However, they had to have retained some sort of characteristic that they would have recognized who they were, or maybe Jesus explained to them who they were. And so here it says that they were talking with Jesus concerning his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. That word departure is a Greek word that you know. And that Greek word is the word exodus. So here is Moses, who led God's people in the first Exodus, talking to the one who was going to make an exodus of his own, which was going to lead to an ultimate exodus where men and women and boys and girls throughout the rest of history could make an exodus out of bondage to sin and freedom in a relationship with God through Christ. And here Luke says that they were speaking about this. The way in which it was written in the original language is the idea of an ongoing, extended conversation. That they had been talking to one another for some time about this ultimate departure, the death, the burial, the resurrection, and I believe also the future ascension of Jesus that was going to happen in Jerusalem in just a matter of a number of months. And as they're standing there, and they're talking about this, they're talking to the one, right? Moses, who wrote the Ten Commandments, is talking to the one who fulfilled every one of the commandments. Moses, who informed the people how God wanted the tabernacle and the temple to be constructed, is speaking to the one whom all of that, the temple and the tabernacle and who that ultimately pointed to, is talking to the one to whom it pointed to. Here's Elijah, to whom represented all the prophets who were telling people for centuries that one day God was going to send his one into the world. Now he's talking to the one who fulfilled all the prophecies, the one who fulfilled all the law. And they're talking to him, demonstrating that is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, that Jesus is the final word. But there's one last event that happened here, one last amazing event, and that is the revelation of Jesus. That all of this happened for a revelation to happen so that Peter, John, and James would know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus is the final word. And so in verse 32, Luke informs, again, this is another reason why I believe in the authenticity of the scriptures, because if you're making this story up, like, you don't include these next words. Now, Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep, but when they were fully awake, he saw his glory and the two men standing with him. Like, if you're making this story up, you're like, hey, Jesus went up to the mountain with three of his closest disciples and they prayed with Jesus all through the night. No, what really happened is these three guys fell asleep. Does that ever happen to you? You're praying and you fall asleep? Like, hey, you're in good company. You're with Peter, John, and James. Like, they were with Jesus. And he's praying, and they fell asleep. Then, when they kind of rub in their eyes, they kind of wake up, they come out of their sleep, and they saw his glory. They saw the transfigured Christ standing before them, and they saw him standing there speaking with Moses and Elijah. And then Luke went on and wrote, and as these were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah, not realizing what he was saying. So at the moment when sanctified silence would be appropriate, we can always expect Peter to speak up. And Peter wakes up and he says, Jesus, it's good that we could be here. And so before Moses and Elijah leave, let's build them tabernacles. And what's a tabernacle? Here's a picture of the tabernacle. You can go to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and you see a life-size replica of the tabernacle. This is the tent of meeting that the people of Israel carried with them as they wandered through the wilderness and before they got into the promised land. And the tabernacle was, as I said, called the tent of meeting. Is where God met with his people. And so here Peter is saying, hey, let's build some tents. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, so that we can come here and we can meet with you, and we can meet with Moses, and we can meet with Elijah. And I love Luke's commentary on this. Peter didn't know what he was talking about. Like, Peter was known to do that, right? He would speak without even thinking. And so Luke's like, yeah, Peter woke up, he saw this, he's speaking just nonsense. He had no idea what he was saying. And even in that, Jesus didn't even acknowledge what Peter had said. But there was an answer literally hanging in the air. Luke went on in verse 34, while he was saying this, a cloud formed and began to overshadow them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. Again, I think the cloud has tremendous significance. It was the pillar of cloud that led the people as they went through the wilderness. It was a cloud that enveloped inside the temple and showed the glory of God so much so that they could not even enter. And so here, this cloud starts to overshadow them. It starts to envelop them. And naturally, Peter, John, and James did what all of us would do, and they got scared. They're like, what is going on here? Then, as that is happening, verse 35, then a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one." It's God the Father who is speaking concerning God the Son. And it's almost the same exact words that God the Father had spoken at the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist earlier. And here he said, "This is my son, my chosen one." Now, in the original language, when Luke penned this sentence, he used what grammarians call the restrictive attributive. It just simply means this. It restricts so that you know beyond a shadow of doubt whom that person is talking about. For instance, if I were to say, the students who studied passed the test, you know that not all the students passed the test, but you know which students did pass the test, the students who studied. And so literally what Luke wrote here is this. He said, the voice came out of the cloud saying, I want to be very clear about this. This one who is my son, he is the chosen one. Which would remind us that just a few verses earlier, Luke had wrote about how Jesus was with his disciples and he asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter responded there appropriately and said, "You are the Christ of God." That word Christ is a word that means the chosen one. And here, God is reinforcing to Peter that you are correct. This one who is my son, he is the chosen one. And then it's as if God said, because all of that is true, here's what I want you to do. And God said, listen to him. Listen to him. Now, if you've ever been around kids, raised kids, been familiar with kids, you know there's a difference between hearing and listening, right? So many times we can hear, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we listen. All right? Hearing is involuntary. Like all of you right now are hearing me. Listening involves our volition. It means that actually taking what I've heard and then actually doing something with it, thinking about it or putting it into practice or something like that. And so that's what God said to Peter, John, and James, and by extension to us 2,000 years later. He didn't say, hey, this is my son, the chosen one. Hear what he has to say. This is the chosen one. Listen to him. And actually, what he tells you to do, because ultimately he is the final word. And then Luke wrapped it up describing what had happened that day with these words. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent and reported to no one in those days any of the things which they had seen. The voice stopped echoing across the mountainside. The cloud started to evaporate. And as Peter, John, and James stood there, the only one they saw was Jesus. Moses was gone. Elijah was gone. The cloud was gone. Which again represented to them that Jesus is the final word. He fulfilled everything Moses talked about. He fulfilled everything Elijah talked about. He fulfilled all the law. He fulfilled all the prophets. And Jesus was there alone. Because Jesus is the final word. Now, before I get to the application, I just want to ask a question that I asked at the beginning. who has the final word in your life? And before you blindly answer like you're Peter, let me just help you think through this a little bit. There are some of us in this room where other people, if we're honest, have the final word. Like we do things to gain their approval. We do things for criticism. We kind of want to fit in. There's things that sometimes we don't do or we're afraid to do because we're afraid of what they might say or how they might react to that, even though what we need to do is right. And what happens is those other people ultimately, in essence, become the final word in our lives. There are some of us here where your past is, you think back to your regrets, things that people have said about you, and oftentimes we think bad things, and absolutely right. There's so many of us that carry that baggage, that weight from the past, but there's some of us too that carry the good things that have been said about us. Allow the praises and the criticisms of people in our past to ultimately have the final word and determine how we live and how we think and how we relate to the people around us. That we allow our emotions to have the final word. We're held prisoner to the emotions in our life, the ups and the downs that we go through, and the anger and the bitterness and or the joy and the excitement, the fear, the grief, whatever it is, and we allow those emotions to have the final word in our life. There are some of us who allow the culture to be the final word. And we've bought into those sayings, hey, just do it as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. You know, you have the freedom to do whatever makes you happy. And when we buy into those voices from the culture, what it leads us to act in a way that would potentially be contrary to God's word. And we allow the culture to have the final authority, the final word in our lives. And we begin to ask the culture for an answer that God has already given to us. I think if we're honest, I think maybe there are some of us in this room, some of us watching online, that if we're honest, we have moments or maybe seasons, maybe even large portions of our life where we're not living as if Jesus is the final word. We're living as if he's just one voice among many. Now, because all of what should we do? And today I want to encourage you to heed the words of Jesus. Don't just hear his words, heed his words, listen to them. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus told a parable that you're all familiar with. A wise man who built his house upon the rock. And the storm came, but that house stood through the storm. He said, on the other hand, was a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. And when the storm came to him, when the winds blew, his house fell down. It collapsed, and great was its fall. If you know the words that Jesus spoke in that parable, what made the wise man wise? Jesus said this. He said, the wise man was wise because he heard my words and put them into practice. He said the foolish man heard the words, but didn't do anything with them, didn't put them into practice. What makes a wise man is not just someone who hears the words of Jesus, someone who actually puts them into practice, that does exactly what God said 2,000 years ago. Listen to him, heed the words, put them into practice in your life. So, how do you do that? I have a very simple 3-step process for you. Okay. Number 1 is show up. Show up. I talk about this all the time. Like, we need to be in church. Every single one of us, we need to show up. We need to show up on a regular basis. But it's even more than that. Don't just show up for church. I want to really make this the totality of what we should show up for. Show up for church. For your reading. Show up. Show up to a small group. Show up to a discipleship group or an accountability group. Show up to a podcast that is teaching authentic biblical principles. Like, show up to those things. You've got to be there. Like, we can't heed the words of Jesus unless we actually hear the words of Jesus. And that's what he said in Matthew 5. The wise man heard them and then put them into practice until you hear them. So show up. And secondly, then, write it down. Make notes. Highlight things in your Bible that are meaningful to you. When you show up for church, I'm not asking you just to kind of fill in the blanks. I give you blanks. That's just simply to hold your attention so you don't fall asleep, okay? But like, write things that are applicable to you. It's amazing to me how sometimes people will come to me and say, hey, when you said this, it was really meaningful to me. And I'm like, I don't even remember saying that. Because that's the way God works. Write down the things as you're reading through things where God is speaking clearly to you. Word of encouragement. It may be a word of confrontation. It may be a word that is requiring you to change your behavior, something, but write it down. And then the final step here, this is maybe the most crucial, is live it out. Do it. Put it into practice. Don't just simply say, well, that was good and that was meaningful, and then just walk away and forget everything. The wise person doesn't. The wise person is going to listen to God and say, when he said, listen to him, because Jesus is the final word. Heed the words of Jesus. And this is what I've discovered in my life personally, is that when I heed the words of Jesus, the other voices in my life get quieter. The voice of my past isn't as loud. The peer group and the peer pressure is not as loud when I'm actively heeding the words of Jesus. And listen, when you heed the words of Jesus, there's freedom. Freedom from the expectation, pressure you're never going to meet that's put on you by the people around you. There's freedom from the emotions that want to shackle you and imprison you. There's freedom from the past that you are never going to outrun. There's freedom from it. When we investigate Jesus and understand the final word, and then in turn, heed of Jesus, and trust me on this, you will be glad that you did. This is my chosen one. Listen to him. Father, we thank you today. We thank you that you have spoken to us in these last days through your Son, whom you appointed heir of all things, and in whom you have created the world. I pray that we, as your people, we would commit to heeding the words of Jesus. We would allow Jesus to determine how we live, how we speak, how we respond in situations. To Jesus, when it comes to our marriage and our finances and our sexuality and our dreams and our future in our life. And so I pray that you would speak to us, that we would respond in kind, and that as a result, we would become wise people who heed the words of Jesus. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.